Carlo Acutis has captured the imagination and hearts of millions across the world, not just because of the miracles attributed to his intercession, but because of the extraordinary simplicity and purity with which he lived his short life. Born in London in 1991 and raised in Milan, Italy, Carlo showed an early and profound love for God, especially the Eucharist. He wasn't a monk or a cloistered visionary. He was a modern teenager who played video games, loved soccer, and understood the power of technology. By the time he was a young teen, Carlo had created an online catalog of Eucharistic miracles from around the world, hoping to ignite the faith of others by showing how the divine still breaks into human life today. What makes his story even more compelling is that, despite living in an era dominated by skepticism and cynicism, he radiated an authentic holiness that was instantly recognizable. It is no wonder, then, that after his untimely death from leukemia at just 15 years old, devotion to Carlo spread like wildfire. Reports of healings, conversions, and miracles began to emerge almost immediately after his passing, leading to his beatification by Pope Francis in 2020. Yet, while his miraculous legacy is undeniable, questions surrounding the state of his body after death have sparked intense debate and some controversy, particularly whether or not he should be classified as an incorruptible saint. The fascination with incorrupt saints stems from Catholic tradition, where some saints' bodies have resisted decay long after death, seen as a sign of divine favor. People naturally wondered if Carlo, so clearly touched by grace in life, might also display this extraordinary sign in death. When his tomb was opened for public veneration in 2020, many were captivated by images showing Carlo's body appearing remarkably intact, dressed in jeans, sneakers, and a casual athletic jacket, symbols of his everyday, relatable holiness. Social media exploded with claims that Carlo was incorrupt, with thousands sharing images and proclaiming that his preservation was proof of his saintliness. However, the real story is both more nuanced and, in many ways, even more meaningful, because it reveals the Church's careful approach to sainthood and the tender way the faithful honor the memory of a beloved soul. When Church officials opened Carlo Acutis' tomb in 2020 in preparation for his beatification, they were faced with a delicate and deeply emotional moment. The Church has very specific procedures for examining the remains of those on the path to sainthood. It is not done out of morbid curiosity or superstition, but rather out of profound respect for the belief that God sometimes grants extraordinary signs to his most faithful servants. In Carlo's case, there was palpable excitement and hope that perhaps his body might show signs of incorruption, which, throughout Church history, has been seen as a powerful indication of divine favor. However, when the tomb was opened, it became clear that while Carlo's body was well preserved considering the time that had passed since his death in 2006, it was not incorrupt in the traditional sense. His body had undergone significant decay, and parts of his remains had deteriorated as would be expected through natural biological processes. This reality was not hidden or denied by the Church. In fact, diocesan officials were transparent in explaining that Carlo's body was found in a normal state of transformation typical of a cadaver. In simple terms, this meant that while there was no supernatural preservation of the body, Carlo's earthly remains were treated with extraordinary dignity. His body had been partially reconstructed, with care taken to present him in a way that would allow the faithful to venerate him and connect with his youthful, vibrant spirit. It was a deeply human moment, recognizing that holiness is not about external signs of incorruptibility, but about the life lived in radical love and faithfulness to God. This decision, to present Carlo in a state that looked peaceful and almost lifelike, led to another important detail that many people misunderstood: the use of a wax mask and partial reconstruction. After the public viewing of Carlo Acutis's body, a flood of confusion and misinformation swept across the internet. Many believed that Carlo's youthful, serene face was his actual preserved skin, leading to cries of miracle and incorruptibility. However, the Church quickly clarified an important detail that often goes unnoticed by the public. A wax mask had been used to cover the face and parts of the body in order to present a respectful and dignified appearance for public veneration. This practice, far from being deceptive or unusual, is actually a centuries-old tradition used when the natural decay of a blessed individual's remains makes it difficult for the faithful to venerate the body without discomfort. In Carlo's case, while portions of his skeletal remains were intact, his facial features had suffered too much deterioration to be displayed naturally. The wax mask was created with careful precision to reflect how Carlo looked in life, preserving his familiar expressions and youthful presence, not to create an illusion of incorruption, but to honor his memory. The use of wax masks and similar restorative techniques is not new in the history of Catholic saints. Many revered figures throughout the Church's long tradition have been presented to the faithful with similar care. Saints, like Bernadette of Lourdes and Catherine Labouré, both often thought to be incorrupt at first glance, are also displayed with wax coverings designed to protect fragile remains and provide a physical reminder of the sanctity of their lives. The Church does not fabricate miracles. It is extremely cautious and scrupulous in documenting what is supernatural and what is natural. In Carlo's case, the Vatican explicitly stated that although his body was found in a normal state of decay, it had been recomposed with the use of a mask. Therefore, the peaceful and lifelike appearance that touched so many hearts was a loving artistic tribute, not a supernatural phenomenon. Understanding this makes Carlo's witness even more powerful because his holiness does not rest on a miraculous body. It rests on a miraculous life of extraordinary love lived out in the ordinary world. While the question of Carlo Acutis's bodily incorruptibility drew much public attention, the Church's discernment of sainthood focuses not on physical signs alone, but on the fruits of intercession, the confirmed miracles that occur through a candidate's prayerful help. In Carlo's case, the miracles surrounding his cause for beatification were not related to the state of his body, but were profound interventions in the lives of suffering individuals. The primary miracle that led to his beatification involved the healing of a young Brazilian boy who was suffering from a rare congenital disease affecting his pancreas. This boy, unable to digest solid foods properly and reliant on feeding tubes, visited a church in Brazil where a relic of Carlo was being venerated. After praying fervently to Carlo for healing, the boy experienced an immediate and complete cure, a healing so medically inexplicable that even skeptical doctors were forced to admit no scientific reasoning could explain it. This miracle was thoroughly investigated by the Vatican, which followed an extremely rigorous and skeptical process that includes medical panels, theological commissions, and the scrutiny of the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. Only when absolutely no natural explanation remains can a healing be declared miraculous. Carlo's miracle met this stringent standard, and his beatification was approved by Pope Francis in October 2020. More recently, additional reports of miracles attributed to Carlo's intercession have continued to emerge. Healings from cancers, recoveries from accidents, and spiritual conversions that radically transform lives. These miracles are the true signs of a soul favored by God. They carry infinitely more weight in the Church's eyes than physical incorruptibility, which, while remarkable, is not a required sign of sainthood. In Carlo's case, his legacy of miracles shows that the power of his holiness is not frozen in time within a tomb, but is active, dynamic, and reaching out across the world, touching hearts and bodies wherever he is invoked with faith. There is a widespread misconception among the faithful that incorruptibility is a required sign for someone to be canonized or beatified in the Catholic Church. In reality, incorruptibility has always been considered a marvelous sign, but never an essential proof of sanctity. The Church, in its wisdom, understands that holiness is not something that can be measured by the preservation of the physical body, but is instead proven by the life lived, the virtues practiced, and the miracles granted through intercession after death. Historically, many saints known for their heroic virtue and powerful intercessions have not displayed incorrupt bodies, yet they were canonized because their lives bore witness to the radical love of Christ. Carlo Acutis fits perfectly into this understanding. His vibrant and contagious love for the Eucharist, his compassion for the poor, his joyful acceptance of suffering during his battle with leukemia, and the confirmed miracle through his intercession after death, all testify to a sanctity that no preserved body could ever fully encapsulate. The Church has always been cautious not to elevate secondary signs above the core reality of sainthood. Incorruptibility, while beautiful and awe-inspiring when it occurs naturally, has sometimes led people into focusing more on the body than on the spiritual life of the saint. That is not the purpose of canonization. The Church raises saints not because their bodies are perfectly intact, but because their souls reflected Christ in a way that calls all the faithful toward greater holiness. In fact, the process of sainthood demands exhaustive examination of a person's writings, their acts of charity, their obedience to the Church, and ultimately, the fruit their life bears in the world: spiritual conversions, miracles, healings. Carlo's beatification followed exactly this path. His online work promoting Eucharistic miracles, his humble and hidden life of prayer, his compassionate spirit that made the marginalized feel valued, and his miraculous intercessions after death all converged into undeniable proof of his sanctity. The fact that his body is not incorrupt does not diminish his holiness. Rather, it reminds us that sanctity is not skin deep, it is soul deep. Throughout the long history of the Catholic Church, the veneration of relics, including the remains of saints, has played a powerful and profound role in the devotional life of the faithful. However, as much as the Church honors the relics of the holy ones, she has always understood that the primary purpose is not to glorify physical remains, but to glorify the God who worked through those individuals. With this understanding, the Church developed traditions to ensure that relics could be venerated with dignity, even when natural decay had taken its course. It is here that the practice of using wax masks, clothing, and preservation techniques became common. When a saint's body deteriorates, especially after many decades or centuries, it can sometimes be disturbing for the faithful to view skeletal remains directly. Therefore, the Church has permitted, in many cases, the careful reconstruction of the saint's appearance using wax or fabric coverings, not as a way to deceive, but to maintain reverence and allow pilgrims to connect emotionally with the memory of the saint's living presence. This tradition explains why, when Carlo Acutis' body was exhumed, a wax mask was lovingly crafted and placed over his skull and hands. Artists and restorers worked to ensure that Carlo's youthful features, his familiar smile, and his peaceful demeanor would still be visible to the millions who wished to venerate him. This was not an attempt to suggest incorruptibility where there was none. It was a pastoral act of mercy, offering comfort to the faithful who would otherwise have been confronted with the harsh reality of bodily decay. This same practice has been used with saints such as Saint Bernadette of Lourdes and Saint Vincent de Paul, whose displayed bodies also incorporate wax masks and other restorations. In each case, the Church has made clear that while the external appearance is recreated, The relics themselves, the bones, the bodily remains, are authentic and venerated with the highest respect. In Carlo's case, the wax mask does not diminish his sanctity. It magnifies it, allowing his life, his joy, and his love for God to continue inspiring people across generations in a visible, personal way. When we step back and look at the life and death of Carlo Acutis, we begin to see that God is teaching a powerful and perhaps uncomfortable lesson about the nature of real incorruptibility. In the Catholic tradition, incorrupt saints are often revered because their bodies, untouched by decay, are seen as a sign that their souls remained pure and close to God during life. But Carlo's story invites us to see incorruptibility in a much deeper way. True incorruptibility is not ultimately about the body, it is about the heart. It is about a life so filled with grace, so emptied of self, so overflowing with love for Christ, that death itself cannot erase its impact. Carlo's young life was a testimony to incorruptible virtue. He practiced charity when no one was watching. He defended the bullied and the broken. He lived the gospel fully in a world increasingly allergic to it. His body returned to dust, as all bodies must, but his soul shines with a brilliance that disease and decay could never touch. Moreover, in a world obsessed with appearances, with preserving youth, hiding flaws, and chasing perfection, Carlo's journey reminds us that holiness does not depend on what can be seen by human eyes. The true incorruptibility that God seeks is not in unblemished flesh, but in a heart that remains faithful, joyful, and trusting even in suffering. Carlo was not protected from pain. His leukemia was swift and brutal. Yet through it all, he never complained. He offered his sufferings for the Pope and for the Church. He faced death not with bitterness, but with radiant peace, famously saying, "I am happy to die, because I lived my life without wasting a minute on things that don't please God." This kind of incorruptibility, of soul, of spirit, of joy, is infinitely greater than any physical miracle. It is the incorruptibility Christ himself praised when he said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Carlo Acutis saw God clearly in life, and now, even through the veil of death, he invites the world to see him too. To truly understand why Carlo Acutis's legacy remains so powerful, we must look at the center of his young and vibrant faith, his profound love for the Holy Eucharist. From a very young age, Carlo showed an astonishing awareness that the Eucharist was not a symbol, not a ritual, but the literal, living presence of Jesus Christ. For him, attending daily Mass was not a duty, it was an encounter with the person he loved most. He often referred to the Eucharist as his highway to heaven and told his mother, "The Eucharist is my road to paradise." While most children his age were preoccupied with social status, entertainment, and fleeting pleasures, Carlo was quietly immersing himself in the mystery that has sustained saints for 2 millennia. He understood that the real incorruptibility the Church speaks of begins with hearts that are consumed by the Eucharistic flame, hearts that are fed not on human praise, but on divine love. Carlo's famous project of cataloging Eucharistic miracles around the world, a monumental task for someone barely in his teens, flowed naturally from this love. He believed with all his heart that if people truly understood the reality of Christ's presence in the Eucharist, they would never abandon the faith. He said, "The more Eucharist we receive, the more we will become like Jesus, so that on this earth we will have a foretaste of heaven." His devotion was not academic or detached. It was intimate, personal, and transformative. This profound Eucharistic spirituality shaped the way he faced suffering and death. It gave him the strength to offer his leukemia for the good of others. It gave him peace when his body weakened, but his spirit grew stronger. It anchored him in a joy that disease could not diminish. It made him spiritually incorrupt, radiantly pure, unwaveringly faithful, fully alive even as he lay dying. Carlo's bond with the Eucharist is, in many ways, the key to why his legacy endures and spreads. Through the body and blood of Christ, Carlo himself became a living tabernacle, a carrier of divine life in the modern world. His body may have succumbed to earthly decay, but his soul, nourished daily by the Eucharist, remains gloriously incorrupt, and through his witness, he continues to invite others to the only source of true immortality. Although Carlo Acutis lived only 15 short years, his impact has not faded with time. It has intensified, expanding far beyond the small circle that knew him in life. In a world increasingly battered by confusion, loneliness, and a desperate search for meaning, Carlo's story has emerged as a bright and unexpected light. His simple message, that sanctity is possible even for teenagers, even in the age of technology, resonates more deeply today than ever before. He showed that holiness is not an abstract, unattainable ideal reserved for ancient mystics or monks hidden away in monasteries. Holiness is accessible, it is vibrant, it is alive in the very heart of everyday life. Carlo evangelized not through fiery speeches or massive movements, but through the quiet testimony of a life joyfully surrendered to God. He reminds young people that the pursuit of God is not in conflict with technology, education, or ambition. Instead, he shows how all these things can be used as instruments to glorify Christ when rightly ordered by love. Perhaps this is why Carlo's influence has continued to spread like wildfire. Pilgrimages to his tomb in Assisi have multiplied. His online exhibitions about Eucharistic miracles created before his death have been displayed in thousands of parishes worldwide, inspiring renewed devotion to the Blessed Sacrament. Countless individuals, especially teenagers and young adults, have written letters and testimonies describing how Carlo's example saved them from despair, addiction, or loss of faith. For many who grew up feeling alienated from the Church, burdened by scandals or crushed by modern secularism, Carlo's joyful witness speaks directly to their wounded hearts. They see in him not a distant, unapproachable saint, but someone who understood their struggles, someone who lived in their world and still chose Christ without hesitation. Carlo's incorrupt legacy lies precisely here. In the transformation he ignites, in the revival of hope he sparks, in the contagious belief that ordinary life, when lived with extraordinary love, becomes a path straight to heaven. In the end, the question of whether Carlo Acutis's body is incorrupt fades into insignificance compared to the stunning truth that his soul, his message, and his witness remain absolutely incorruptible. In a church often weighed down by centuries of ritual and at times battered by scandal and division, Carlo emerges as a prophetic figure, a reminder that true holiness is not about spectacle, but about fidelity to Christ in the small hidden places of daily life. His beatification is not a celebration of a preserved body, but of a preserved spirit, one that continues to call thousands to rediscover the beauty and joy of the gospel. Carlo shows that sainthood in the 21st century will not be marked merely by external miracles or ancient signs, but by the radiance of lives truly conformed to Christ, lives that shine even in a digital, distracted, and cynical world. Carlo's incorruptibility lies in the incorrupt heart he carried, a heart that loved the Eucharist with every fiber of its being, that loved the poor, that loved his friends, that loved his God without compromise or calculation. His life is a rebuke to the growing darkness of despair that plagues modern youth. He proves that even in an age drowning in relativism and spiritual apathy, a heart fully alive in Christ can change the world. For the future of the Church, this is the kind of saint that will lead the new generation. Saints who are not defined by mystical phenomena alone, but by a burning authenticity, a joyful purity, and an incorrupt love that no illness, no decay, and no death can destroy. Carlo Acutis was not spared suffering. He was transfigured through it. And now, in heaven, he stands as a beacon to all who dare to believe that holiness is possible, necessary, and urgent today. His body may have returned to the earth, but his soul is brilliantly alive. And through his life and miracles, Carlo continues to whisper to the world, "The real incorruptibility is the heart that never stops loving God."